one, so we don't need every last detail. The first thing to remember is that the process on this one is to synthesize, and you notice the word present in the prompt itself. Remember that the process of synthesizing or synthesis requires you to kind of survey everything, read it through, but come to your own conclusion based on what you're given. Having outside information is great, but we want to synthesize based on the sources. And so that's the big thing. That's why they give you this reading time to kind of look. So if we notice with how the prompt itself is focused, they tell you here, the need to memorialize events or people is complex. That should definitely stand out to you because they're acknowledging there is more than one side to this, and that often someone can have a feeling that is contradictory. When you think about someone being complex, I want you to think about the person that you know, because I guarantee you do, that is very moralistic. They don't necessarily have to be very religious, but they're maybe very moralistic, yet they curse like a sailor. And you kind of have that bit where you go, how do those two sides of you work if you're so religious or so moralistic and yet you do that? That is that idea of being complex. It can be contradictory. And so you can both love the concept of a memorial, but really hate some of the concepts that go with it. And so they're acknowledging that. In some cases, monuments honor moments of great achievement, while in others, monuments pay homage to deep sacrifice. We see that in the examples that they chose. They specifically tried to highlight different kinds of monuments. Like, how many of you felt like the one about the lobster guy was kind of a joke article, where you were like, that's not real? It is. You can find pictures of it. Like, it's a real statue. A monument's size, location, and materials are all considerations in planning and creating a memorial to the past. Notice that here they're giving you some different ways to view your sources. And in revisiting this, you might start to think, oh, wait, I do have, they did touch on the difference in something as simple as materials used, because we had examples of monuments that are cut into mountains, monuments that are cut into the earth, the idea of downsizing the grandeur of a monument or a memorial. We have all of these kind of playing into it. So they're trying to give you as student different ways that you can approach constructing this argument. What they want you to do is read the following 7 sources carefully, looking as well at the introductory information. So we had talked about that. They give you the MLA formatted citation at the top. So it can sometimes tell you a little bit more about when was this published? How current is it? What do we notice about the possible bias of it? Then in a well-organized essay that synthesizes at least 3. Keep in mind, you can't use 3 sources. You're not going to pass. They're not going to play with you. And honestly, they shouldn't have to. For any of you that are watching this at home, for any of you that are sitting here, if by this point in the year you can't follow a simple instruction like that, I don't think you should be allowed to get college credit. It's not that difficult. And so even though I'm saying it, I guarantee you at home and here, there are people that can't follow this. They write these essays that use 2. There's really no discussion beyond that. So we need 3. For support, they want you to examine the factors a group or agency should consider in memorializing an event or person. And notice that this end requires you to talk about both in creating the monument. So we've got to think, what do we have to think about as a factor we should consider in even going towards it? And what should we consider in creating it? So they tell you, make sure your argument is central. So we know we've got to create something that's an actual argument. We can't be like, you have to think about things before you build one. No, duh. But you would be surprised. A lot of essays will start this way because a student just doesn't know what to write about yet. They haven't taken the time to pre-write and get their thoughts together. They just figure, I got 40 minutes. I got to get moving. I'll figure it out as I go. And your hope is, and I saw this a lot on rewrites. I saw this a lot on mock exams. Your hope is that you can use your conclusion to kind of come back together. If I can restate my thesis at the end, maybe I can restate it more specifically. Maybe I can talk about what I know. Maybe. A simple trick, if you want to hear it, maybe this time it'll stick. When you're handwriting these, skip the first 8 lines of your test booklet. Write your first body paragraph. Then when you're done, go back and write your thesis at the end. All of a sudden, it makes it seem like you knew what you were doing the whole time. So they want you to do that. Don't summarize the sources. Well, duh. And then they say, indicate clearly what you're using, whether through direct quotation, paraphrase, or summary. So don't simply rely on any one of these. You have that ability to use multiple ways. That's going to show your ability as a writer. And then they tell you, cite your sources such as source A, source B, or using the descriptions in the parentheses. Stick to one or the other. Some people want to keep flipping back and forth. Stick to one or the other. Let's take a look at some of these sources to kind of go, all right, what do we notice here? What do we see? How can we use it? Let's start with source A. This is the bit that comes from a book published by a university press. So that tells you this is an academic kind of source about Washington, D.C. specifically, the National Mall and the monuments that are there. Anything stick out to you here as you read this article that can help us, that, you know, maybe gave you an insight? So again, remember, we got to talk about, one, factors you got to consider, and in actually creating the monument. What do we use to do it? How do we do it? Yeah. Yeah. A big part of this chunk that they pull, talk about this idea of attachment or connection. And so he phrases it at the start by kind of contrasting that we live in a state, a country, a whatever, that is kind of founded on the written word. We often forget that mass literacy is only a product of the last 100 years. Nobody really cared that everybody should be able to read until the more modern era. So when we look at this idea of we're a country that's founded on words versus, you think about, you just came off of taking the US history test, so just think about it. Why did some of the pamphlets that were produced during the Revolutionary War really make a difference? Well, it was because somebody would read it in public. And so you would whip people into a frenzy through the delivery of it, not just the words itself. And so notice that he kind of contrasts this idea of kind of in this way of building around the word and trusting that everybody gets it versus this idea of bringing people together, creating that sense of attachment. And so towards the end of the article, he mentions here that a monument manufactures its own aura. And so he tries to frame this in terms of a word that stuck out to me, civil religion. That essentially, it's kind of like creating this concept in the old world of having a pilgrimage. And he uses this word too. Oh yeah, I pointed right to it. That's awesome. Remember, in the old sense, a pilgrimage is a religious trip to see an artifact. And often the artifact was meant to belay the concept of belief. You know, if you could see the chains that fell off of St. Peter's arms while he was in prison that God supposedly made fall off, wow, you can see that miracles can happen. So here it's creating that same sense. But did anybody come away with this with kind of a negative taste in their mouth about how he talks about monuments, how he talks about this concept? So I'm just going to argue the other side here. Notice that he talks about Lincoln, for example. And he specifically points out within the course of the article that the Lincoln Memorial, it doesn't matter where it is. They just kind of picked a location. It's not about Lincoln did something here. They just were like, I don't know, over there. We cleared some dirt, put it there. Notice that they choose to like highlight speeches that he gave, and they print them so large that you're forced to stand very far back, almost in reverence because of the scale. You notice that they also decided to build this like an old school Roman temple, and they point that out too. And so in mixing these concepts of religion and state, by the end of it, he starts to talk about how everything about the experience marks it as extraordinary and authoritative. Authoritative can be a really negative word. And if you start to build this concept that this man who was president is someone we should revere almost like a Roman god, think about the way that you now inspire people to think about the state of their government and their leaders. Now, does the article necessarily make that clear? Is that the way the article is presenting the information? No. But if you're looking at how can we use an article on both ends as positive and negative to think about some of these things, as a critical thinker, you should be able to distinguish that just because this is more glowing doesn't mean you can't argue the other side using it. You see what I'm saying? So even though we're synthesizing information, we can absolutely synthesize to make it work how we see. Often they like to give you a picture, a cartoon, a something of this sort. And here they focus on a statue of Christopher Columbus. What do you think? What do you come away with?
Well, my first thought was that not a lot of people agree that Columbus should be immortalized.
There's been a very growing controversy about this. Now, again, this is 2013, so you got to keep in mind, this is 8 years ago. So we got a little bit, but even then, there was that little bit. Where's this statue? Where? Uh-huh. So anybody remember from history? Where's Christopher Columbus from? Where? He's Italian. Okay? So if you know anything about American history and sort of that, a lot of your Italian immigration in the early part of the 20th century and the late 1800s was all focused northeast part of the country, right? A lot of them were going there. And at the time, man, they viewed Italians the same way they viewed, your African American culture. They were less than. The Ku Klux Klan was specifically after Italians because they were largely Catholic. They saw them as barbaric and dirty, and especially as more and more came and the concept of the mob started to develop, they saw them as just this undercurrent. But to an Italian American, here's their cultural hero. This is the guy we can hang our hat on. This is the Italian that did something in this country. And so a lot of these statues and memorials of Christopher Columbus exist in that part of the country. Parades still happen in those parts of the country for Christopher Columbus because of the Italian cultural connection. So if you're looking here, you got to think about, hey, where's his statue? What do I know? How can I leverage that? Now, look at how he's depicted too. Think this is really how he dressed? Think this is how he looked? You think he came on shore like that kind of commanding presence? Like, this is mine. Probably not. He was probably a lot dirtier than this, and his hair was nowhere near that clean and kept. But you know what? Think about how we want to consider that memorial thing. How do we want to depict him? Do we want to depict him as the guy who's stumbling off the boat, maybe seasick, his hair all a mess? Or do we want to depict him as this heroic figure? Look, he did it. We notice some of these things. The picture can tell us a lot if we engage with it. But we got to think, what do we see? What do we notice? I'm not going to talk about every source. Let's see. If I'm going to run through, notice that this third one talks about the Crazy Horse Monument. He's able to bring up a couple of points that are really salient. He talks about the fact that it bothers him and that he sees Mount Rushmore as graffiti to some degree. You're defacing this beautiful mountain. It is unnatural. He talks about the depictions versus the reality of situations. We're going to show Crazy Horse, but there's not even a picture of the guy. We don't really even know what he looks like, yet we're going to build a monument to him. Okay. They also start to tinge into this. There are very few mentions of it in explicits. But did you notice that they kind of touch into cultural relevancy? That they talk about the things that are being sold at a Sioux memorial that aren't even produced by the Sioux people and that most Americans don't even know the difference? One quote that stood out to me that can really help to make your argument, again, towards the end, he mentions eternity is not on our side. Why do you build a monument? Why do you build a memorial? Huh? To memorialize it for who? Future generations. You're hoping to outlive. You're hoping that a lesson can be passed on or some kind of depiction can work. Eternity is not on our side. We can control the narrative, if you want to think about it that way, in our lifetime. But what happens after that? I want you to think for a second. We're going to get kind of dark. Don't get too sad. Hopefully we don't touch the nerve. I'm going to go here. I'm going to take the chance. I want you to think about your grandparents. Okay? I want you to think that at some point in your life, you are going to be the only person alive that remembers your grandparents the way that you do. You may be the last person that remembers what their voice sounded like. You may be the last person that remembers certain details about them. But what happens after you die? They just kind of become another picture, right? And so you got to think eternity is not on our side. He mentions it here with the fact that, hey, these mountains are eventually, in a geological sense, we can put a freaking monument on a mountain, but the mountain's going to fall at some point in the geological record. It's going to be resurfaced. It's going to look different. But think about and contrast that quote with Lobster Man. Let's go down to that one. What they mentioned about the Lobster Man statue that kind of helps you with this idea of eternity is not on our side. Yeah, that quote about eaten by rats. They put this plaster statue in there. We forget about it. Eternity is not on our side. We can put up a monument. We can think it's going to last. We can think it'll inspire future generations. Well, we're seeing it right now. What if the future generations don't want it? What if the future generations don't see the value in it? Then you kind of become like the weird one. Anybody not know what to do with source D about the cemetery? Because you were just like, what? I thought we were talking about monuments. It is. You ever drive by an old cemetery and you wonder who goes there? Because you're just like, why would anybody go there? Everybody's been dead there for like 100 and some odd years. Who knows anybody in there? Yeah. Or how many times have you gone to visit a relative's grave and you kind of notice it's like nobody's been there? Heck, all my grandparents are buried in Philadelphia. I'll go there. I don't know that, we don't have anybody that lives there anymore. So it's like, great, they're there. This concept about how it works and how it lasts is what they want you to synthesize and kind of work through. Let's talk about what our next step should be. So once we have our we read the articles, we thought about the articles, we processed. What do we do? What are some of those steps we want to look at? So first, we should be kind of taking notes as we're going through for how we can formulate. Then we've got to start to look at how are we going to actually construct this argument. Again, it's synthesized based on the sources. So what are the sources telling you? Don't go in with your own opinion. Your opinion is invalid. Nobody gives a crap what you think. So don't frame it in a first-person way. Frame it as authoritative. This is what it is. And use the sources to inform it. Some of you are going to go, but that's not what I believe. Question asks you what you believe. Question says, based on the sources, synthesize your argument. So take yourself out of the equation. We don't want to have to get caught up in that. Make the work easy for yourself. What are the sources leading you to understand about this? Think about how the sources talk to each other. We said, if we can isolate a phrase like that concept of eternity not being on our side, maybe you start to look at where is that present in some of the other sources? And how can I show that a common idea is being talked about in multiple places? that could form a whole paragraph that can show that, hey, these sources together have helped to synthesize my argument. This isn't just me going, they're dumb. That's not what we're being asked. So look for those opportunities where those sources talk together. As we look to construct, remember that one of the big things on the row B scoring talks about that line of reasoning. Basically, does your thesis introduce how you're going to discuss the topic? And does that roadmap provided in the thesis kind of play out through the rest of your paper? It can be a really simple, my 3 reasons are A, B, and C. And so you look and you go, one paragraph is A, one paragraph is B, one paragraph is C. But your line of reasoning can also be the driving concept behind how you're going to discuss these sources. And so don't let it just be one of those where you go, all right, I'm just going to write and I don't quite know what's there. You've got this time to plan. And I can guarantee you 5 minutes of simple pre-writing where you write your thesis on your test booklet and you write yourself a rough outline of how that's going to play out in terms of the paragraphs you're going to develop will absolutely create a better essay because you know where you're going. You might give up 5 minutes at the start, but I guarantee you're going to produce a better product at the end. And so that pre-writing, super, super easy to look at. Let me stop this. Let's see what the photo is.